Myers, and I am a Foundry Fellow. I'm also a third-year law student at Santa Clara University School of Law, where I study intermediary liability law and content moderation. For my day job, I am also a legal policy specialist for Google Trust and Safety, but I am here in my personal and academic capacity. For those of you who aren't intimately familiar with the Internet Law and Policy Foundry, or the ILP Foundry, we are a professional development organization composed of early career professionals who work across law, technology, and policy. We aim to foster a community of diverse voices through writing, network building, constructive debate, and more. Today's event is the first, oops, I apologize, that's an error there. Today's event is brought to you in partnership with the PIT Commons of DC, a multi-institution collaboration providing DC graduate and professional students with open access to public interest technology career development resources. So with that, with dis and misinformation campaigns and voter interference at scale, and with the current mass media infrastructure, this discussion will focus on election misinformation, disinformation campaigns now, and how we expect this to evolve over the years. So things such as accurate voting information for voters, use of social media to combat mis and disinformation, and equity and fairness in voting. That will be what our speakers will be focusing on today. Without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. So first we have Christina Wilford, who is principal of the Kara-Cohen Strategies and senior advisor of disinformation strategies at the Strategic Victory Fund, where she is helping US organizations detect, respond to, and preempt orchestrated disinformation in elections. As a global democracy activist and international development expert, Christina has worked on the ground with advocates in over 25 countries in hotspots such as Ukraine, Turkey, Serbia, Syria, Kosovo, Kenya, Tunisia, and Afghanistan. Next, we have David Brody, who leads the digital justice initiatives at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. He focuses on issues related to the intersection of technology and consumer privacy, free speech, hate group activity. I'm gonna make sure we mute if we're not muted, reminder. Government surveillance and racial discrimination. The Digital Justice Initiative engages in anti-discrimination litigation and advocates for civil rights protections from abusive commercial data practices. David previously served in the Federal Communications Commission, where he helped write federal regulations protecting broadband internet consumer privacy and conducted antitrust review of telecommunications mergers. And last, certainly not least, we have Professor Spencer Overton, who is the president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which was founded in 1970, and is America's Black think tank. He is also tenured professor of law at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Professor Overton is the author of the book Stealing Democracy, The New Politics of Voter Suppression, and several academic articles and popular commentaries on voting rights, race, and public policy, including state power to regulate social media companies to prevent voter suppression. In 2020, he testified before the Communications and Technology and the Consumer Protection and Commerce subcommittees of the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce on disinformation online, and submitted answers to additional questions for the record for that hearing. He also testified before the Election Subcommittee of the House Administration Committee and submitted answers to additional questions for the record, and submitted comments to the FCC opposing the Trump administration's petitions to prod the FCC to adopt rules that would discourage online platforms from removing disinformation that suppresses Black votes and other objectionable material. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and kick off our discussion by first talking about how we got here. I'm going to start with Christina. Can you set the stage for us and give us some background on the online misinformation/disinformation issue when it comes to election integrity? What is the scale of the harm of misinformation and disinformation that is caused, and where do we go from here?
Sure. So jumping in, so as you mentioned, my background is really looking at this from a global democracy and elections perspective. And what is somewhat unique about the US is the way that disinformation has been supersized, largely exposing the failures of social media platforms to properly police and deal with the toxicity of their product is the way that I would frame this. And it therefore made it vulnerable for a massive amount of disinformation, largely from domestic actors. You know, at the beginning of the year, there was a great amount of concern around foreign interference and influence campaigns, which we should absolutely still be concerned about because those things are at work. But the way that the election integrity was attacked was largely by domestic actors, as we've all seen unfold with very grave circumstances leading to the insurrection attempt. So, you know, we can unwind through this conversation why that is or how it came about. But it's a combination of a variety of things, of a set of individuals who had the intent to use and disinformation to mislead the public about the integrity of the election system, combined with social media platforms who some may argue are literally designed to spread this misinformation, with policymakers who have been, in the US especially, very reticent to really deal with the regulatory frameworks that would orient the right type of solutions in order to rein in big tech in some meaningful way. David and other panelists have, you know, incredible amount of experience in what we've collectively done to combat this and to get citizens the right information. But we've seen the power of certain narratives and lies around the election itself that are fueling, you know, really up until yesterday, much of the debate around the election. Happy to dig further, but that would be my opening kind of framework.
Excellent, thank you. David and Professor Overton, please feel free to expand on that point. And specifically, you know, we're interested in, well, as, you know, who is creating or spreading this disinformation, misinformation? Is it foreign? Is it domestic? Is it bots, paid accounts? A little bit of all of it. David, I'll kick it over to you.
Sure. So it's predominantly organic content, meaning that it's not paid advertisements, and it's just a collection of regular people for the most part. You know, it's a complex ecosystem with a lot of different actors in it. There are going to be some bots amplifying things, although the platforms have done a pretty decent job over the past couple of years of starting to figure out how to address some of the bot activity. But what we saw in this election cycle in particular was it was largely real people who were deceived to believe, either were deceived to believe things that were false, or were engaging in trolling activity or otherwise, you know, malicious activity to spread false narratives. I don't think that, you know, like Christina said, I'm sure there was an element of foreign interference because it's not difficult for our adversaries sometimes to just sort of pile on and amplify. But this was largely domestic driven by regular people.
And Professor Overton, I don't know if you want to chime in. I think you're muted, by the way. You're still muted.
I'm good. Yep. No, I'm sorry about that. So, you know, I agree with David, and this stuff evolves from time to time. A big threat in 2016, you remember, was advertising. And I agree that this time, that the challenges were a bit different. I do still think that there is the potential for advertising in large part because of the targeting of platforms and the delivery, specifically the delivery to particular communities. We saw, you know, like 38% of the ad buys, Facebook ad buys in 2016 by the Russians were directed at African Americans. But even this time, I think with the Russians, when we think about foreign interference, you know, they were often like just amplifying Trump's messages. So like Trump had disinformation that was put out there, and they were actually basically recycling and retweeting his disinformation. And so, you know, I think that is it's going to evolve and it's going to change from cycle to cycle. And I think that a lot of the push in this last election was from those who wanted to prevent responsible content moderation by just kind of like anything goes, and another force that I would say that I was a part of, and David and others were a part of, that were just kind of pushing companies to engage in responsible content moderation.
I think this tees up nicely to talk a little bit about what the responses and solutions might be. But before we get into that, you know, we're always quick to talk about how do we get rid of misinformation, disinformation, or how do we prevent it, prevent its spread. But, you know, with any kind of content moderation decision or policies that we create, we kind of have to start at the very beginning and figure out, well, what exactly is misinformation and disinformation? Christina, could you walk us through what misinformation is versus what disinformation is?
Sure. There's lots of different academic practitioner explanations. You know, I like to put it in this framework. You know, disinformation is really the system in which bad actors are purposely manipulating information in order to mislead or to achieve a particular goal. Misinformation is often unintentionally shared, wrong, unfactual information that the user who may be perpetuating or bringing that information forward doesn't actually know that it is not factual. So a lot of the misinformation around the voting process fell into a larger disinformation strategy to undermine the election for a particular intent. So people who were posting concerns about the post office and their ability to, you know, deliver vote by mail ballots may not have been intentionally misleading people by sharing that information, but the larger attacks against the post office and the way that that information was seeded was a disinformation campaign.
And in your opinion, and David's Professor Upton, feel free to jump in anytime. In your opinion, when we're talking about the spread of this and disinformation, would you say that, would you offer a percentage as to how much of it comes from traditional media versus how much you would pin on an internet service, for example?
Well, it's very layered in the US. What you have is especially dangerous in that much of these sources that are being consumed in partisan camps, and especially among more far right individuals and ideologically minded folks, are consuming information that they don't in fact realize is part of a disinformation campaign. So it looks like local news. It's actually connected with a massive network that Sinclair has set up, serving information that is in fact sometimes even coming and sourced from Russia Today. So it is a layered effort. It's hard to sort of unwind. And it's a very dense book, but one of the, I think, amazing sources on this from a couple years ago is networked propaganda. So networked propaganda talks about the asymmetrical nature of right-wing media, essentially. So it analyzes backward 2016 and the Internet Research Agency and how that unfolded. And that polarization of the media space is also still very much a part of the way that communication systems are set up. And it's compounded then by different bad actors who are violating terms of services across different platforms in order to create coordinated sharing and make certain narratives go viral by manipulating those algorithms that then information, you know, builds on. So that is a very concerted strategy in which many attack lines and narratives around the election unfolded, and that a network like QAnon, which, you know, metastasized many, you know, years ago, and was undealt with in the platforms, could lead to a situation today, you know, where 2 weeks ago people stormed the Capitol who truly, in some cases, believed that they were part of a revolution and that the election had been stolen from them. That conspiracy-based mindset was made possible by, you know, multiple types of media that they were consuming to contribute to this alternative reality in which those individuals are living, including members of Congress who are QAnon supporters now, newly elected. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, and if I could add just a little bit, I think, you know, there in the past couple of years, there's sort of been this inversion where it used to be that some of these narratives would start in the major. You might have something that is a talking point in a major media outlet, and then it goes online where people who watched that TV show start talking about it and twist it in different ways, and it metastasizes. But what we've sort of seen recently in the past couple of years is it's going the other direction. So we are more likely now to see conspiracy theories or fringe theories, misinformation, disinformation start on the web, build traction through major social media platforms, and then major media says, hey, look at this thing that's happening online. And sometimes major media outlets do that in a responsible way to critique and debunk conspiracy theories. And sometimes you have people like Tucker Carlson who just give a national platform to those theories in a much more robust way. So, you know, for example, in like the white supremacist context, in the context of you know, some of the more hateful white supremacy stuff, one example is you might see a fringe white supremacist conspiracy theory begin on the 4chans and 8chans of the world, and it then, amongst like the truly hardcore hateful people, it then might move to a podcast hosted by one of these right-wing individuals, or to Telegram, or to some of these other sort of like peripheral, sometimes fringe, extreme social media platforms. From there, it'll jump to Twitter, where it'll start to get sort of tacitly, quietly shared by white supremacist leaders who have not yet been banned from Twitter despite repeated reports. And then it will get amplified through their followers and many other followers. It will migrate to Facebook, especially private Facebook groups that do not have a lot of visibility into what's happening on them. And from there, it's endemic in the ecosystem. And then it becomes something that where, you know, that's how you end up with you know, a Fox News personality talking about the Great Replacement, which 5 years ago would have been an extremely unknown and rare white supremacist genocidal theory.
Just let me add one thing there. And here's a specific, just building on what David said, example, is that when we entered the pandemic and when we entered COVID restrictions and shutdowns and for people's safety in the spring, this is when we saw a tremendous growth in Facebook groups in order to focus on rejecting, you know, COVID restrictions. Those Facebook groups, in essence, over time, became a far-right organizing network, combining militias, individuals who openly involved in militias, with anti-vaxxers, with COVID restriction, with sort of the election is stolen, stop the steal groups. That built upon itself. There's over 900 of those groups on Facebook. And what makes it particularly problematic is that Facebook's algorithms are recommending group more groups, you know, to individuals, that then spiral them into these disinformation, misinformation loops, because of the way that their system is set up. And I'll drop something that elaborates on that point in the chat.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and move to our careers discussion now, just kind of on time here. If you all have questions that are, you know, more specific into this deep dive about misinformation, disinformation campaigns, please feel free to ask them in your individual breakout rooms as well. But this is a great conversation, and we really appreciate kind of the deep dive that we did today. Jumping into the careers questions. So I'm going to start with Professor Overton. Which direction is this topic going, and what areas of research should students proactively look into to maximize impact in the mis and disinformation research area?
Yeah, I think that, you know, the fact that this is evolving, you know, David talked about the fact that the last election cycle is different than the one before. So kind of understanding both the facts of this past election cycle and then also the legal issues, I think, is important. So if we were to do a scan, obviously 230 is a provision where there's kind of is very contested, and there is a lot that's there that can be and should be discussed. And you know, President Trump had a take on that, and certainly we pushed back on that. But I think that is a fertile ground for exploration. And I think there's some other questions about law and what tools outside of 230 can or should be used. If we were to step back and think about a career, to me, in AI and also in platform accountability, also in privacy, major question is, what's the role for self-policing? What's the role for regulation and, you know, government oversight here in terms of these spaces? And to me, that is a lively discussion where there can be, there's a lot more work that could be done. I really feel like we're at the beginning of this discussion and this debate, and that really careers could be built around exploring these questions in terms of what's the role of the law here, and what's the role of markets to address these issues.
As someone that has built an entire career around exploring and researching Section 230, I could not agree with you more. Let's see, let's go to David. What skills are most useful to someone looking to begin a career in doing this work?
You know, I mean, obviously there's sort of the general legal skills if you're a lawyer, and I'm a lawyer, and I'll just sort of caveat this with, you know, Spencer and Christina are more on the research side of things, and they are really expert researchers. I am not a researcher, so I can't speak to that as much. We at the Lawyers Committee, we're more on the practitioner side of things, but you know, if you want to be an advocate, activist, a practitioner, you know, like Spencer said, like honing the legal skills is really key. And, you know, also there's a fair amount of just sort of consuming lots of information all the time and just sort of osmosing and what's going on in the ecosystem, to just sort of keep up with how the different platforms are operating and parsing their explanations for why they're doing what they're doing. So, you know, a lot of it is, you know, understanding some of the legal frameworks involved. So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, some of the operable civil rights laws like the Voting Rights Act, and various privacy laws. Well, we don't really have a federal privacy law, but you know, the sort of ecosystem there, and understanding or sort of trying to digest like how, you know, trying to map that onto how is a random 25-year-old on TikTok trying to undermine the election today, right? So like there's a lot of disparate things going on here. But at its root, a lot of it is just consuming large amounts of information and figuring out how to distill it, and figuring out, figuring out in particular, where are the pressure points and the leverage points for different actors in this ecosystem. So you have the platforms, you have Congress, you have federal agencies, you have state agencies and state attorney generals and state legislatures. You have private nonprofits that can bring litigation or other advocacy, and then you have other business leaders who don't want their ads running alongside hateful conduct. There's a whole lot of different stakeholders in the ecosystem, and one really useful skill is trying to figure out, like, where are the pressure points where if I push here, I can make something happen there, right? There's only so much you can do by talking to the platforms and asking them to do better, because at some point you run into their business model, and their business model says doing bad things is profitable, because if doing bad things wasn't profitable, we wouldn't be doing it. So there's only so much you can push there. So then the question is, okay, who can push the platforms from another direction? Do you try to do an advocacy or boycott campaign with advertisers to try to get them to pull their ads from the platform to put economic pressure on the platform? Do you go to Congress, try to ask for a new law? Do you want to reform Section 230? Do you want to pass federal privacy law? Do you want to pass new civil rights laws? Do you go to federal regulators who already have legal authority to go after certain types of discriminatory practices, not necessarily everything, but those regulators, you got to understand, are going to be slow and have limited bandwidth. So a lot of it is just like seeing the full landscape of options, and when you are running into a brick wall over here, look for a door over there.
Super helpful. And on that note, Christina, what moral questions should students, or really anyone that's entering this field, be asking themselves before deciding how, or with what agencies or organizations or companies they should get involved with?
Yeah, so this is a really compelling question, and I love David's sort of mapping of the different levers. I think being clear about where you see yourself in the ultimate impact you want to have in your work, and what kind of company you want to associate yourself with is an important question. And in fact, we can see the way that employees at Amazon, employees in Facebook have had an influence to say, enough is enough, we have to do better, as well as engineers in Google and others who are willing to look at the ethical implications of the design of these products. I think everyone has to have that moral centering at a point in which, the collective we, I believe, don't want to be party to systems that are ultimately damaging people and subverting our democracy, as we saw this play out in the most dramatic, of terms. I would also make a plug for an area that is really underdeveloped in the kind of research and efforts around disinformation that has also major implications, which is what we call gender disinformation. So this really, as an activist, as an advocate, as someone who has helped women try to break barriers to run for office in many parts of the world, what we see is that there's a deep program of disinformation and harassment actively at work to undermine the leadership of women. So you have attacks of women in elected office that are ongoing and pervasive. We had massive online coordinated campaigns attacking Vice President Harris. that were with sexualized content, were undermining, were cross right-wing properties. You had attacks on women candidates during and after primaries. You had attacks spurred by the Reopen so-called protesters, who then were in fact plotting to kidnap Governor Whitmer in Michigan. And that mindset, that softens the ground and intersects very directly with what we call the manosphere, which is, a deeply misogynistic online network of content and memes and bad actors who are trying to silence the voice and participation of women. And in fact, most of these things, if we take Facebook as one platform, should be are already violative of their terms of service, but they're not policing it. They're not addressing it in any meaningful way. Ultraviolet is an organization that did an ad directly at Sheryl Sandberg asking her to step up and do more. Now, we heard her last week, deny and go out and say, like, Facebook had nothing to do with the Capitol insurrection. It wasn't us. And in fact, data came out 2 days ago showing that in fact, it was a major organizing hub. One of the programs piloted in Australia to deal with revenge porn was with engineers in Facebook who recommended that women send naked photos of themselves in advance so they could be scanned in order to identify revenge porn. Now, perhaps only a male engineer would come up with that kind of solution. So, I think that we have to look at who are we as people, where do we want to put our energy and time into which aspect of this work and which company, and how do we try to hold these companies accountable internally and externally so that we get better solutions, whether it's gender disinformation or election disinformation or the vaccine rollout, and we will witness the difficulty in getting a fully vaccinated American populace because of mis and disinformation.
Jess, I want to just jump in quickly. I just think it's a great opportunity to move into a space because if not a lot of folks who are on the Hill understand or know these issues. It's not like there's a long line. It's not, it's not a topic like wills or something else where you're just kind of getting in line for 20 years, right? You can really jump right in and make an impact. So that's one thing. I think another piece is, there have been other instances in our history of things that are just not good that have resulted in an accumulation of wealth, right? If you think about, the system of slavery that, really allowed us to be second only to Great Britain in terms of an economic superpower. It was like cotton was half of our exports here. If you think about the Industrial Revolution and climate change that grows out of that. So sometimes there's, again, a concentration of resources and wealth that comes, and wealth can be decent, but there are these just negative byproducts that are not internalized in terms of the cost. They're externalized. And the question here is, right now with tech, there's a lot of good stuff in terms of innovation and change of the world, et cetera. But how can we prevent externalizing those costs and not ending up with something like, climate change or systemic racism that kind of stays with us for generations? And how can we get the industry to basically internalize those costs so that they're just not spun out? And to me, that is the work that folks could and should do in terms of moving into this space.
Fantastic, super insightful. Before we go ahead and break, I want to just see if any of our panelists have any final thoughts, any words of advice for students. David, I'll start with you.
I think Spencer really hit on it where he said that this is a really emerging field and there's just lots of opportunities everywhere. I remember not too long ago when I was coming out of law school, like it doesn't always feel like there's opportunities everywhere. Sometimes you have to sort of make them. And the economy right now is not as good as it's been sometimes. But, you know, I think it really is true in this space where every single type of organization needs to figure out how its work and its mission intersects with big data. You know, every type of advocacy organization has to figure out like how their mission intersects with what's happening online, how to promote their mission, how to, you know, get their message out in a responsible way. Every lawmaker has to engage with it. Every federal agency, state agency has to engage with it. There's just, you know, data touches everything. So at every level, there's a need for more people to dig into these issues. And that means, you know, you like Spencer said, you don't necessarily have to get in line for and you know, get on the wait list for the next fellowship at the ACLU. I love the ACLU. They're wonderful. They do great work, but they're not, you know, there's more opportunities than that. You know, you can find, you know, you look around for the places that are struggling to get their message out in a responsible way, or that are struggling to engage with these new problems in a responsible way. And then you look to see, like, do they actually have someone that knows these issues? And then, you know, see what you can do.
And Christina, any final thoughts?
Yeah, there's a phrase I adopted as my own mantra, and I like to share it, which is the idea of starting where you are, using what you have, doing what you can. And so for that, it may mean that some of what you're looking at as, you know, big corporate jobs, or however some of the big tech, you know, excitement about working within those industries, you know, you might be better off localizing how can more humane, ethical tech work in your community. What are the ways in which the design of certain apps can encourage citizen participation and engagement? How can you work with a, you know, city council member or a state legislator who's trying to bring, you know, more dialogue and discussion, and figure out, is there media literacy type of programs that, and critical thinking that we need to build into school curriculum? You know, there's really all sorts of entry points within this field. And I would say, you know, be innovative, be thoughtful about the things that may not be the, you know, as glamorous on your resume, but actually might be more impactful with the things that you can have influence over.
And Professor Overton, any other final thoughts as well? And you are muted. Step right.
You know, we're on this device for like a year, and I'm still struggling to get this mute thing down here. So, you know, we got these two things, especially somebody starting their career, and they're kind of at tension with one another and being comfortable with the tension, right? One is, I'm getting skills, I'm developing things. You know, I was at a large law firm for about 4 years. And that was really important in terms of my growth. We had, like, you know, a lot of companies, corporate clients, etc. I worked very, very long hours. That experience was really important to me in terms of acquiring particular skills. And so it's not a situation where somebody graduates. There's so much that people learn in the workplace, whether it's working with other people or particular skills that aren't learned in school. So, hey, recognizing that one's continuing to acquire skills and being comfortable with that. And that's okay, even if you're not at, you know, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund right now, right? So that's one piece, right? On this other piece is you think about your mission and why you're here. Thinking continuously about where is there the need and what's next. So as opposed to just thinking about kind of the rear view mirror and, you know, the glamorous strides toward equality we've made in the past, and how do you go stand exactly in the same footsteps as somebody else, how you can think about what is the need right now and what's the next step that may happen and how you can be right there. You know, people who are focused on innovation and the development of products are often thinking about what's next. But when we think about social change, I mean, I think we have to think the exact same way in terms of like, what's next, where is this going, and how can we be there to ensure that things move, you know, in a direction of equity, inclusion, as opposed to exclusion. What's next?
Thank you so much to all of you for your wonderful insight. With that, we're going to go ahead and kick it out to the breakout rooms. It was wonderful chatting with all of you. And Nafi, I'll let you take it from here.